Go. Welcome everyone to our fourth and final session of Paul within Judaism. Today we're looking at the memory of Paul, or Paul's remembered or understood in the later segments of early Christianity. And so we'll be hearing from Lyn Kidson and Michael Koch. First of all, I'll hand over to Lyn. Lyn, welcome along, and thanks for coming, and we look forward to hearing your paper.
Thank you for having me, Mike. I've got a PowerPoint because we're dealing with materials that we might not be all that familiar with.
Okay.
Can I do that? No.
I think
Host is disabled.
Try now. Try
out, okay. So we're looking at the Paul's Jewishness in Christian memory. Okay, I'll go back. There we go. We can be in no doubt as to the impression the Apostle Paul left in Asia Minor. Berchius, Bishop of Hierapolis, died in the late 2nd century and left an epitaph composed by himself. In his epitaph, he tells of going on a long trip to Rome and Syria and to the furthest point east in the Roman Empire, and was accompanied with Paul beside me on the wagon. He was in some ways retracing Paul's missionary trips and symbolically extending them. Earlier epitaphs in the remote Charchama Valley, south of ancient Iconium in Lycaonia, have been found, which commemorate Christian men bearing the name Paul. Stephen Mitchell argues that the use of Paul's name indicates the impact of his mission in the region as described in Acts 14 and 15. We will take the memory of Paul to be the subset of paradosis. In other words, the figure of Paul as a legendary figure, which is a historical figure, which is now legendary. In turn, we'll take tradition here to mean that which is handed down, paradosis, to be in terms of how things are done. This will help us to distinguish between the recollection of Paul's memory as Jewish and his practice of Judaism. What we'll be investigating in this paper is the preservation of Paul's memory as a Jew in Asia Minor. When one examines the reception of Paul in many of the early Christian documents associated with Asia Minor, his distinctive Jewish identity seems to disappear. I will be arguing that the battle for a purely Christian identity, in contrast to a Jewish identity, led to a battle over Paul's tradition in Christian churches in Asia Minor in the first 2 centuries. Dennis MacDonald, in The Legend and the Apostle, argues that the Acts of Paul preserve oral legends of Paul and Thecla circulating in Asia Minor in the 2nd century. MacDonald's argument is quite persuasive, and what I wish to argue is that the reception of Paul's memory was not confined to written sources. Lurking behind our written material are oral histories and traditions about Paul. What our written sources are testament to are the negotiations of these memories and traditions of Paul the Apostle. In this paper, I will be interrogating the Pastoral Epistles, the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, and the Acts of Paul for traces of this negotiation. I will be suggesting that the contest represented in these documents is a contest over Paul's tradition. In this contest, opponents are labelled as Jewish, and in this arena, Paul's Jewish identity disappears. The writers of the Pastoral Epistles and the story of Thecla, along with Ignatius, all appear to be distancing themselves from what they thought was Jewish. Now, I'm going to talk about the parameters of this study. Before beginning with the study proper, I wish to set out some parameters. Paul Trebenko argues quite persuasively against Bure's earlier thesis that Paul's memory had disappeared from Western Asia Minor in the 2nd century. it is very unlikely that Paul was forgotten in Asia Minor, as Brewer suggested. Rather, Pauline Christianity remained influential. Instead, Trebenko makes the case. The much more likely explanation is that John and some of John's readers know the Pauline tradition well, but John has chosen not to speak of that tradition. It is much more likely that John made no use of the knowledge of Paul that he had. The reason for this is that John's main opposition in the 7 churches was the Nicolaitans, who were involved in eating food offered to idols and in idolatry. Scholars have often drawn parallels between the strong in Corinth and the Nicolaitans, and suggested that the Nicolaitans may have been influenced by Paul or may have radicalized Paul's teaching. Thus, the Nicolaitans probably appealed to Paul for support. Trebenko makes a very salient argument that Paul's memory and his teaching was contested and selectively used. While Trebenko argues that John of Revelation chose to ignore Paul, what I want to suggest is that the other writers working with the Pauline tradition made selective use of the Pauline epistles, or more correctly, those that they had access to, and his tradition in oral form. Trebenko's argument with Brewer was that Paul's memory had disappeared in Western Asia Minor. But I think we can extend his findings based on his observation that there was a contest over competing Orthodox traditions. Trebenko argues that the contest was over church structure rather than doctrinal disputes. Putting this together, our starting point is Trebenko's observation that Paul's tradition, including his letters, were still in active use in Asia Minor. Our study will be extending this view, focusing on the reception of Paul from Western Asia Minor to Laconia in the East, examining it for the use of his Jewish identity or otherwise. The time frame for this reception will roughly cover the latter 1st century to the mid-2nd century, or from the Pastoral Epistles, which I date with Trebenko from 80 CE, to the writing of Acts of Paul, which dates from about 170 to 175 CE. The greatest difficulty of piecing together the aligning memory of Paul and Pastoral Epistles is the assumption by the writer that his audience is familiar with Paul's history. There are shared assumptions between the writer and his audience. In the opening salutation of 1 Timothy, relies on the shared knowledge between the writer and the audience, built, it seems, on the Corinthian correspondence. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, according to the command of God, is how he opens in 1 Timothy 1. Oh, sorry, I should read the rest. And Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, according to the command of God, our Saviour, and Christ Jesus, who is our hope. It's structured in a similar way to 1 and 2 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians, it's Paul called an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God. And in 2 Corinthians, it's Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God. I have argued in my thesis that the change from the will of God to according to the command of God was an indication that the writer was styling the Pauline biography in terms common in Asia Minor. It related to the appearance of a deity who commands the devotee in a vision or dream. This indicates that the writer of 1 Timothy has made a conscious decision to select the phrase by the command of God to describe Pastoral Paul's appointment as an apostle. Thus, the writer of 1 Timothy is aware of the Pauline tradition and the historical Paul that became an apostle by seeing the Lord as in 1 Corinthians 9, through a vision, as in Acts 9 and Galatians 1. But the writer of 1 Timothy assures the self-image of Paul as one who had advanced in Judaism and was zealous for the tradition of my ancestors, as in Galatians 1:14. His image of Paul in 2 Timothy is moderated. Paul worshipped as my ancestors did, it says in 2 Timothy 1:3. This reflects Timothy's upbringing in faith by his mother and grandmother, as it says in 2 Timothy 1:5. However, nothing is said of their Judaism. The reader must rely on his or her knowledge of the tradition of Paul meeting Timothy in Lystra in Acts 16. The important picture we have of Paul from 1 Timothy is a scripture using Paul. The wrangle with the opponents in 1 Timothy seems to be over the use of scripture. But Pastoral Paul asserts that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, 1 Timothy 1:8. He uses Genesis 1-3 twice to combat the opponent's teaching. In 1 Timothy, both Pastoral Paul and the opponents value the scriptures, but they are at variance in some way, most likely over the use of it. The Paul of 1 Timothy is interpreting and applying Genesis to correct his opponent's instruction. At the very least, the memory of Paul here is that he is skilled in Jewish methods of interpretation. This brings us to the characterization of the opponents in pastoral epistles, and 8 points I think can be discerned, but I want to highlight 3 of them. Fourth one is they are ascetics. They forbid marriage and abstain from certain foods. The 5th one, Pastoral Paul responds to an interpretation of Genesis, arguing that marriage is good. And the 6th one, in Titus, the myths of 1 Timothy 1:4-7 and 2 Timothy 4:4 are defined as Jewish. Titus 1:14. In summary, the opponents of Pastoral Paul appear to be as Jewish as he is. This makes the process of distancing those who are the other difficult, as they are overlapping identities. Yet in Titus, Pastoral Paul calls the myths Jewish. We cannot take this at face value. It does not necessarily mean that the opponents are Jewish Christians. Thus, Jewish is a negative descriptor. What we don't have is anything that could be readily identifiable as Jewish myth. Such a search would be futile. What we have are either oral traditions or literature being used in a Christian context that could be labelled as Jewish, as myths and as Jewish by an opponent. Certainly, we can summarise that the writer of the Pastoral Epistles would wish to distance Paul from the opponents, their interpretive methods, and their literature or oral traditions that could be labelled as Jewish myths. Paul's Jewishness is thus downplayed, except for his skill as an interpreter of Scripture. I'm going to turn to Ignatius now. We will now briefly turn to Ignatius's letter. Recently, John Marshall has made the persuasive case that the Christians and that Ignatius was opposed to were not 2 groups, but one, understood as a single group of Jewish Christians who understood Jesus to be an angel. As Marshall describes, it seems that the practices undertaken and the text interpreted and the associations kept by the objects of Ignatius's wrath were orientated towards Judaism more strongly than Ignatius thought proper. We find out from Ignatius that these other Christians were keeping the Sabbath. In the letter to the Philadelphians, Ignatius castigates certain Christians for promoting Judaism. But if someone should interpret Judaism to you, do not hear him, for it is better to hear Christianity from a man who is circumcised than Judaism from one who is uncircumcised. As Marshall describes, Ignatius indicates the complexity of the issue of Jewish Christianity, but he should be taken almost literally. There are people who are ethnic Jews and who preach what Ignatius calls Christianity, and there are people who are not ethnic Jews and who preach what Ignatius calls Judaism, though a scholarly observer might call it Jewish Christianity. Marshall then goes on to make the case that his opponents claim that Jesus only seemed to be suffering was rooted in Judaism. Although Ignatius does not make explicit that he considers those who hold this view as Jewish, Marshall makes the case that such a view is built on the Jewish ideas about angelic mediators found both in the Septuagint and in Jewish literature. In Tobit, the angel Raphael reveals his otherworldliness. As for me, when I was with you, I was acting not on my own will, but by the will of God. Bless him each and every day, sing his praises. Although you were watching me, I really did not eat or drink anything, but what you saw was a vision. And at Qumran, the evidence suggests that the Archangel Michael was an angelic messianic redeemer figure. This evidence makes it feasible to suggest that some Christians thought that Jesus was a mediating angel. While I agree with Marshall that Ignatius is disparaging his opponents as Jewish and that they hold to Jewish practices, we should be careful in describing these Christians as Jewish Christians. Ignatius takes a step further than the writer of the Pastoral Epistles by jettisoning a Jewish identity for Christians and developing a new identity. As Douglas Boyan argues, he is the first to juxtapose Judaismos with a new word of his own, Christianism, Christianismos, a term that historians customarily translate Christianity. Ignatius coins this term, however, not to give birth to a new religion, but in order to set up a contrast between the followers of Jesus, who rely too much upon identifiable Jewish practice, and others who have given them up. Boyan then goes on to make the case that Eusebius develops this idea from Ignatius and other earlier writers, such as Clement of Alexandria, who had presented Christians as a race or ethnic group unique among Mediterranean peoples. And this is a salient point in our discussion. What makes Christianity Judaism is what Ignatius perceives as Jewish practices like keeping the Sabbath. Such people deny the flesh of Jesus, and these people, he says to the Ephesians, bear the name of as a wicked deceit. Instead, the Ephesians are told that there is one physician, both fleshly and spiritual, born and unborn, God made come in the flesh, true life in death, and both from both Mary and God, first subject to suffering and then beyond suffering, Jesus Christ our Lord. In a very similar manner, the writer of 1 Timothy confesses that the living God was revealed in the flesh in 1 Timothy 3:7-16. Earlier in the letter, the writer again in quasi-poetic form assures the believers in Ephesus that there is one God. There is also one mediator between God and humankind, Christ Jesus himself, human, who gave himself as a ransom for all. It is only in Ignatius's letter to the Ephesians that Paul's name makes an appearance. In the New Testament literature, Paul is the founding father of this church with a long-standing relationship. All the other churches that Ignatius writes to, Paul does not have such a relationship. In Ignatius's letter to the Ephesians, Paul is described in superlative fashion as the holy one who received a testimony and proved worthy of all fortune. For Ignatius, Paul is the ideal apostle who is holy and so can testify supremely and is supremely blessed. The true Christian adheres to the faith and love that are in Christ Jesus. Since the divine prophets lived according to Jesus Christ, and the faithful Christian adheres to faith in and love in Christ Jesus, thus Paul, the supreme Christian, must for Ignatius also live according to Jesus Christ and not according to Judaism. So up to Acts of Paul. Acts of Paul contains the story of Thecla, and Thecla's story is set in Iconium and Pisidian Antioch, and it is possible that these stories circulated independently. The story of Thecla, which is in chapters 3 to 4 of the Acts of Paul, begins with Paul fleeing Pisidian Antioch to Iconium. At this point, the story reflects the journey of Paul in Acts in 1350 to 14:1. But that is where the similarities end. In Acts, Paul is accompanied by Barnabas, and they are persecuted by the Jews in Antioch and unbelieving Jews in Iconium. In the story of Thecla, Jews do not appear. The persecution is carried out by her own family and by Gentile authorities. Only in the story of Thecla do we have a physical description of Paul. He is short, bald, bow-legged, healthy-looking, single-browed, a bit of a long nose, and bustling with benevolence. He at times looks like a mortal, and at other times like an angel. Paul is welcome into the house of Epistles, where he preaches a sermon with 13 points. Thank goodness that pastors don't do that anymore. This sermon is styled like Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are they is the refrain. Of interest to us is the emphasis on purity of flesh in point 2. They are blessed who are self-controlled because God will speak to them. And blessed are they who kiss the world goodbye. That's points 3 and 4. The next point is about sexual enunciation in marriage. Blessed are they who have wives, but do not have sexual relations with them, for they will be heirs of God. And point 13, the most significant of all, is blessed are the bodies of virgins, for they will please God and not lose the reward for chastity. For the Father's word will become a saving action for them on the day of his Son, and they will enjoy eternal rest. The emphasis on sexual enunciation by Paul is dramatically opposed to the Pastoral Epistles. I should have went to the other slide, sorry. The heroine Thecla hears Paul preaching and becomes a teacher, a missionary, and she's martyred twice. This stands in contrast to the carefully negotiated activity of women in the Pastoral Epistles. Paul and Thecla travel together. Paul spends most of his time healing and preaching. In many ways, the image of Paul in Acts of Paul is much like Jesus in the Gospel. But in spite of this, Paul is not presented as Jewish. Neither is he a teacher of the Scriptures, as he is in the Pastoral Epistles. There are no Jewish opponents or any opponents other than Gentile unbelievers. Certainly there are no critical Christian voices, only Thecla's pagan mother who objects to her vow of chastity, crying, "Burn this enemy of patrimony," in the middle of the theatre. True spirituality lies in renunciation. Virgins are especially blessed. Thecla receives an amazing salvation from the Lord, which we are to take to be related to her continued virginity and refusal of wealth. Those who revere God will become God's angels, as Paul says in his sermon. And indeed, Thecla in the arena has a vision of Paul as the Lord who ascends into heaven. This may hint at an underlying docetism. However, later in 3 Corinthians, which is inserted into the Acts of Paul, doceticism is explicitly rejected. Paul may be preaching sexual enunciation, but his Christology is orthodox if we use Ignatius as a guide. Given the possibility that 3 Corinthians was inserted into Acts of Paul, this could be an attempt to redeem a much beloved story for those holding an orthodox Christology. In summary, Paul's physical appearance in Acts of Paul looms large. One can conclude from the epigraphical evidence that the memory of his presence and ministry in Laconia was significant. Paul's tradition in the Acts of Paul is an ascetic one. It is in Thecla's story that Paul's Jewishness is completely stripped away. What we can conclude, I think, is that in Laconia, Paul is remembered for being an ascetic and leading a movement of a new humanity who transcends their earthly lives. And I can stop sharing now to the conclusion. The evidence we have gained from the Pastoral Epistles and Ignatius is that Paul's memory and tradition was highly contested in Asia Minor after his death. Those practices that were rejected were labelled as Jewish, and Paul's identity as a Jew was carefully brushed into the background. Even more starkly, Paul's identity in the story of Thecla is stripped of its Judaism. Instead, he becomes a universal man. He is almost indistinguishable from Jesus, who lacks any Jewish identifiers. What we can deduce about Paul's Jewish identity in Laconia? Was it viewed as a liability in the context with those like the writer of 1 Timothy and Ignatius who labelled their practices as Jewish? Or was it irrelevant since Paul was the universal man? The writer of 1 Timothy could not escape Paul's Jewish identity, as he and his audience had at least a copy of Corinthian correspondence. Perhaps the believers in the remote highlands of Laconia were without this resource and relied on their received tradition. What we can conclude is that in Asia Minor, Paul's Jewish identity had to be managed, if not jettisoned altogether. For many, Paul was not Jewish, but a universal man. His asceticism, a sign of a new humanity that was destined for an spiritual existence without worldly flesh. All our writers seem to be distancing themselves from Judaism. In many ways, they share a lot in common, but the writer of the Pastoral Epistles and Ignatius do not share in the Christology of their opponents, and in this reflects a Pauline view of Christ. But in his nuanced arguments on the identity of Gentile and Jewish believers in Christ and the resurrected flesh seem to become liabilities for later believers. His subtle negotiations, so evident in his letters, collapse in the torrid context over his memory in Asia Minor. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Lyn. Sounds like there was not a good run for the Apostle Paul as a Jewish apostle in the 2nd century. Okay, I'll hand over now to Michael. You have the first right of comment or reply to Lyn. So over to you, Michael.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for this paper. And, you gave us a glimpse of Paul's reception in Asia Minor. So I found it really interesting. And I like the parameters of it, that you're like, here's the location and here's the date range. And I wonder, depending on decisions we make about the provenance of other Christian texts, what might change in that reconstruction of what we added or what we took away. But I thought I'd ask a couple questions about just the pastorals and Ignatius. The first question is, what encouraged you to date the pastorals to around 80 CE? Because I know, so for the minority of scholars who defend the authenticity of these letters, they probably won't go with the thesis that this is the reception of Paul. And of course, if we accept this pseudonymity, others would date them in the first half of the 2nd century, like Dennis MacDonald that you mentioned.
Yeah.
So the reason I think it's important is just if it's a late first century or early second half of second century, when does Paul's memories of as a Jewish figure start to being downplayed? You know, is this an earlier or a later development on this kind of trajectory? And the second question I have is just about Ignatius's opponents and you know that angel Christology they might have had. Like I kind of go back and forth about, you know, as he's referring to Docetists, and I like in the classic sense of denying the corporeal body of Jesus, or Jewish Christians in one group or two groups. So, you know, I'm willing to go with Jewish Christians, or at least a group he's calling Jewish, so maybe even Gentile Judaizers to some extent there. I wonder if instead of angels, he could have like martyrdom traditions in the background about, you know, the martyrs don't feel any pain. I think of the Gospel of Peter even, where, you know, it's as if he doesn't feel pain, and, you know, in his language about seeming to suffer. But, you know, ultimately, I agree that Ignatius is trying to construct something he calls Christianismos in opposition to Judaismos, and bring Paul and even bring the Hebrew prophets on his side of the debate, and when he's constructing these social boundaries. So I'd just be interested in if you'd elaborate further on this group that he's calling Jewish, that, as Marshall argues, that has an angel Christology. So date of the pastorals and Ignatius's opponents. I'm interested to hear more.
Yeah. So the dating of the pastorals. Yeah. So I've gone with Trebenko. I'm in line with Trebenko actually, because it's my kind of feeling that it's in the second half of the first century, because as I think we can see here, I mean, if you line up the these documents up, like it makes more sense that the pastoral epistles are like first in this kind of because I had this really nice answer for you and it escaped me. Because I really worked really hard when I started my PhD to go, well, if it's Paul's written 1 Timothy, it's going to jump out at me. And it didn't, because the evidence just runs off in the other direction. And I think just the second century is too late for the kind of discussion that the pastoral epistles are having. And I think like it's like too late after what Ignatius has to say, because, you know, Ignatius is like creating this second, this other humanity, it's Christianism, whereas the part of the pastoral epistles isn't doing that. He's still kind of, he's before Ignatius, I think. That's my feeling anyway. This is just this asceticism like is a new thing that's appeared, and he's not tackling it in the direct way that Ignatius is. And he's also, you know, he's Hymenaeus and Alexander have been expelled from the community, but in my research, I found that he's really setting it up so that they can come back if they repent, you know, once they've learned their lesson that they've had out in the realm of Satan. So there's still, I think, negotiation going on about these ascetics, which I don't think you see in the second century, because as you go along, I think, and I think Edwina Murphy would agree with me on this, that asceticism grows in popularity, and whereas the writer of 1 Timothy is rejecting it. So I think that's indicates that it's a first century document. So it's not Paul, but we're not right up into the second century. So going halfway 80 seems like a good place to land them, but somewhere in the second half of the 1st century. Does that answer your question? Okay. As for Ignatius and his opponent, so I am going against Jerry Sumney, who thinks that we've got 2 groups here, and I feel a bit nervous about that. But anyway, but I think it makes more sense to have just the one group that's problematic in the churches on the western side of Asia Minor, because I think we've got to remember that most of these places are really close together. Like some of them are only a walk away, the actual physical location, and they're well connected with by the roads in Asia Minor. So my feeling is that we've got one group, and I can't deal with it here in this chapter, but the whole Jewish mysticism thing, but I think we've got to wrestle with. It is quite prominent in this part of Asia Minor, and it's John in Revelation going off and having a celestial trip and talking to angels. It's a really prominent feature of Jewish mysticism. So I think that's where what we've got here is a reconfiguring of Paul's Paul's teaching in terms of this Jewish mysticism.
Thanks so much. Thanks for your paper.
That's okay.
Thanks, Michael. I think we can probably have one more question for Lyn before we go back to Mike. Does anyone have a question? Ron, I believe you got a question.
Yes, I do. My question is this one. Why does the label Jewish become a negative descriptor in the early reception of Paul?
That's a good question. Let me be Socrates. What do you think? Yeah, I think it's got to do, and probably Brian Tucker could help us out here, to do with the negotiation of identity. So not being so trying to maintain a Christian identity as opposed to a Jewish identity. And I think it's really interesting that Ignatius is really hard on those people who still want to go to the keep the Sabbath. I think it's about forming and maintaining a boundary between who is Jewish and who is a Christ follower, and they're doing that in terms of we're distinct here now, and you guys over there, that's Jewish, and anything that looks Jewish we've got to put over there and create as the other. And I think that's the reason why Jewish becomes a negative identifier. It's about the othering and forming a boundary so that you maintain your Christian identity.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Lyn. So golfers clap for Lyn. Thanks for doing that. Next, I have to hand over to Michael Koch. Now, I think Michael deserves the award for person having to do conferences in the least agreeable time zone in the world. The guy who drew the short straw is not the Germans, not even late at night, not even us Aussies. I was outraged at having to get up at 5 in the morning but Michael's, I think, probably had to get up about 3 or 3:30 in order to do this. So, Michael, special award for you, man. Special award for you. Okay, your pain is seen, man. Your pain is seen. So I appreciate the effort you've gone to just to be up and alert at this time.
Michael, can you? I must have missed it. Where is Michael?
No one really knows. It's kind of like in Australia, if you drive east, you hit Adelaide, and then after that, it's like those medieval ocean maps that say, "And here there be dragons."
I got it.
I think
we call that flyover country. Yeah.
He's out in the west there.
He's out in Western Australia in a charming city called Perth, which is known for its very big mining industry, and more recently its kind of xenophobia, which is that they've locked the border, they've locked out all the other states from visiting, so it's kind of an in-house Australian joke. But Mike, I'll hand over to you. You can take. I think you're doing what Paul and the Ebionites, if I remember correctly. So over to you, Michael.
Yeah, great. Yeah, no, it's been great listening to everyone's papers, even despite the early morning, and that's why it's a bit dark here in the background. But a real honor to be invited to the conference as both a junior scholar and not a specialist on Paul. A bit intimidating to get to interact with all the experts on Paul, where my research has focuses on the reception history of early Christian writings. And I'm working on a project on Matthew right now. So I've spent a lot of time with the Ebionites and the Nazoraeans lately, so I thought that's where I could interact with the conference on how Paul was received in these communities. So I'm going to read my paper, but I'll probably skim and summarize over some parts of it. So in their monographs surveying the reception of the apostle to the Gentiles among Jewish interpreters in the pre-modern and modern eras, Daniel Langton and John Gager agree that the vast majority of Jews over the last 2 millennia have not had any real familiarity with the contents of Paul's letters, much less vilified their authors. Langton concludes that, quote, "The truth is, until relatively recent times, Jewish treatments of Christianity have very rarely mentioned Paul, the focus of attention and hostility having been Jesus until the time of the Enlightenment and the Emancipation." Gager concurs that Jewish scholars have rarely polemicized against Paul before the 19th century. So, quote, "The ideas of a centuries-long, unbroken chain of anti-Pauline writings among Jews just doesn't exist." Increasing Jewish engagement with Paul in the modern period kind of coincides with developments in Protestant scholarship on Paul. Of course, you know, in the 19th century, Ferdinand Christian Bauer and the Tübingen School in positioning Pauline Christianity as the antithesis of Jewish Christianity, or we have the old and new perspectives that might characterize Paul as either a critic of legalism or ethnocentrism, and may perhaps caricature Paul's Jewish contemporaries in the process. Some scholars advocating the Paul within Judaism approach are also involved in this intramural Jewish conversation about Paul's legacy. So we're fortunate to have, you know, Mark Nanos and Paula Fredrickson here at the conference, and Pamela Eisenbaum, also her important contributions about Paul. So I might even have to reconsider how I define this school in light of the conversation that we've had at this conference. But nevertheless, I think long before the 19th century, we do have some Jewish Christ groups, or better known as Ebionites, who did malign Paul for his alleged antinomianism. And so right back to Bauer's model of Christian origins, the Ebionites were seen as kind of the successors of the Jerusalem apostles and that original Jewish Christianity. On the other hand, one of the earliest responses to that school was to focus on Epiphanius and his portrayal of the Nazoraeans and the Ebionites as an offshoot of them. So that as they seem to be portrayed in Epiphanius and Jerome, the Nazarenes are Jewish believers in Christ who seem to have the same creed and canonical books that Epiphanius did, may have even respected Paul's letters, but continued to practice the Jewish law. So several scholars are convinced that this is the group that is in continuity with the apostles, since of course Paul is described as one of the ringleaders of the Nazareans in the book of Acts. Due to space considerations, I will concentrate on the select patristic testimonies about the Ebionites and the Nazareans, so the traces of anti-Pauline polemic and other putative Jewish texts, such as the sources of pseudo-Clementines, won't be factored into this study. I guess a starting point for me will be that I think the heresiologist portrayal of Ebionites and Nazareans as sects or philosophical schools might be a little bit misleading. That if we get outside how they want to depict these Jewish followers, titles like Ebionites and Nazareans may have been quite common among a variety of Jewish Christians or even other Christians. So I would instead argue that there probably were lots of Jewish Christ believers in the patristic period who continued to observe the terms of the Sinaitic covenant and believed that Jesus was qualified to be a messianic figure because of his perfect law observance. And that at least by the 4th century, there might have been some other Jewish Christians who were beginning to make their peace with the larger Catholic Church of their day and were reconciling their own interpretation of Paul's epistles with their own attitudes towards the covenant and covenantal nomism. So let's kind of turn first to the patristic portrayals of the Ebionites. So again, with the heresiologists, we have to be very cautious. Of course, they're polemical and tendentious, and they also tend to paint their targets along the lines of philosophical schools with their own founders and their distinct ethos and ideas and rituals. This is nowhere more evident than the invention of Ebion, the fictive founder of the Ebionites. Of course, scholars, we know that the term is a transliteration for the word for poor ones. I don't see any evidence that this term was used as a title in the 1st century. Of course, Paul raised a collection of money for the poor or the poor saints among the Jerusalem congregations. But it's probably more talking about their material poverty, and it's not a self-designation. Epiphanius tells us a story about how the Ebionites called attention to the book of Acts and the earliest believers in Jerusalem voluntarily donating all their possessions as their own account of the origins of their name. But this might just be a response to their detractors, who often use the title as an excuse to insult the Ebionites and claim they had poor opinions about Christ or a poor way of life. Of course, Epiphanius echoes those critical judgments as well. So probably the title became a popular one among a variety of Jewish Christ followers, maybe because it either reflected their actual socioeconomic status or because of the valorization of poverty in the Hebrew Bible or in the sayings of Jesus, such as "Blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom." The earliest extant reference to the Ebionites is in Irenaeus, where he summarizes that the Ebionites were skeptical about the virginal conception of Jesus, so he was born to Mary and Joseph. They seem to privilege Matthew's gospel to the exclusion of all other gospels, and they abhor Paul as an apostate from the law. For examples of how they conduct their lives in accordance with the biblical commandments and keep Jewish customs, Irenaeus specifies that they expound on the prophets, they circumcise their sons, and they adore Jerusalem as if it was the deity's house. So either the posture of their prayers was directed towards Jerusalem or the city factored into their millenarian hopes. So leaving aside the question of whether they would have agreed with the standpoint of the Paul within Judaism, Paul, about the requirements for non-Jews entering the Jesus movement, it seems that the Ebionites were actually chiefly offended by their understanding of Paul himself as someone who abandoned his own customs and was encouraging his fellow Jews to do so as well. So perhaps a hint of what we hear in Acts as well, when James says, you know, the Jews here are hearing about you, encouraging people to turn away from their laws in the diaspora. Though Irenaeus' description of this group is rather vague and kind of stereotypical, he doesn't seem to have any firsthand knowledge about them and probably consulted an older heresiological catalog. Some scholars guess that maybe it's an updated copy of Justin's anti-heresy catalog. The reason I say updated is when you actually read Justin's dialogue with Trypho the Jew, for all his tirades against poor Trypho, he's actually surprisingly tolerant towards Jewish Christians who adhere to the law of Moses, so long as they do not impose it on others. And he can even allow a situation where non-Jewish Christ followers who Judaized could be saved as well. Now, that's not to say that he didn't disapprove of a certain Jewish Christ followers who may have held that Jesus was a messianic figure, but not pre-existent or divine. And he puts this Christology on Trypho's lips, where Trypho can say Jesus is the Messiah. Why do you accept that he's divine and pre-existent? And he tries to refute that as well in making that case. So I think he's aware of a kind of Christology that the Ebionites have. The Ebionites, their fidelity to both Jesus and the Torah is a recurring feature of the patristic testimonies. Sometimes the patristic writers emphasize that they try to maintain their Jewish and Christian practices. So Eusebius tells us that they commemorated both the Sabbath and the Lord's Day on Sunday. The 3rd century Roman author of the Refutation of All Heresies, commonly attributed to Hippolytus, but that's now in question. He represents the Ebionites as claiming to be justified, or according to the law of Moses. And I know in using that word justified, there's all kinds of debate about what you do with Paul's Decai terminology or pistis and pistis Christou. But it's hard not to see that statement as kind of a polemical inversion of what Paul says in Galatians 2:16 or Romans 3:28 about not being justified or Decai according to the law. Though I do recognize in Romans 2, you have that language about the doers of the law will be justified. So that has to be factored in too. For Tertullian, Ebion's heresy, it consists of circumcision and the law, and this was already refuted in Paul's letter to the Galatians. So whether they're the successors of the missionaries that came into the Galatian community or not, isn't as clear for Tertullian, but he sees Paul's at least refuting their ideas. And back to Irenaeus, he's mainly fixated on the Ebionites' Christology. And he takes a lot of effort to, refute their denial of the virgin birth based on his own theology of the incarnation and of recapitulation. He compares the Ebionites' cosmology and Christology to 2 other demiurgical thinkers named Cerinthus and Carpocrates. And on the one hand, Cerinthus and Carpocrates, as far as their theological worldview, seems very different from the Ebionites. So both of them argue that there's a transcendent, supreme deity far beyond the material world, and that the material world was created through an inferior demiurge. So for Cerinthus, that's an undefined power. For Carpocrates, it's malevolent angels. So Irenaeus clarifies that the Ebionites don't have that view when they accept that the God of Israel was involved in the creating process. But where he seems to say that they were the same as Cerinthus and Carpocrates is that all 3 of them denied the virgin birth of Jesus. They said Jesus was born of Mary and Joseph, and that a spiritual power possessed him at his baptism. Now in the paper, I note there's actually a text critical issue about whether Irenaeus does say the Ebionites are the same or not the same as Cerinthus and Carpocrates with regards to their opinions about Jesus. But most scholars will say they were the same, that he's bringing them up in the context of the discussion because they're so different otherwise in theology, because he detects a parallel in their Christologies. And a later scribe misunderstood this and so inserted not the same. And so we actually have the Greek text from the author of the Refutation, who gives us the same, versus the Latin text that has the not the same. So on the one hand, you could say they're all the same, that they argue that Jesus was a regular human who was possessed by a spiritual power. So probably better labeled a possessionist Christology rather than an adoptist one per se. But the parallels are superficial. Of course, for Cerinthus and and Carpocrates, Jesus was possessed by the divine Christ, who came from the spiritual realm of the unknown Father to reveal truths about that realm. So that's a far cry from the Ebionites, who probably just understood Jesus to be possessed by the Spirit of Yahweh, who anointed Jesus. And they probably understood Christ to mean the anointed one, in the sense that prophets, priests, and rulers could be anointed and empowered by the Spirit in the Hebrew Bible. Tertullian wants to help the Ebionites along by saying it would be better if they argued in Zechariah, or argued from Zechariah, that an angel possessed Jesus. But it's not clear the Ebionites hold this view, just that Tertullian thinks that would be a useful proof text for them. They probably just think Jesus was possessed by the Spirit for his prophetic and messianic mission. Also, I doubt that they held the view that is attributed to Cerinthus, that this divine being, this Christ, and departed from Jesus before he was crucified. Because in this view, which I think is better labeled a separationist Christology, divine beings can't suffer, and so it leaves the human Jesus to die alone. I don't think that was the Ebionites' view at all. I think they just had a human exaltationist messianic Christology. So there's a tension, though, here that Irenaeus claims that the Ebionites deny the virgin birth, and yet they have an exclusive preference for Matthew's gospel, which obviously clearly has the virgin birth. So some of the later church fathers try to solve this problem. Eusebius switches the gospel of Matthew with the gospel according to the Hebrews as the Ebionites' favorite gospel, and Epiphanius accuses the Ebionites of mutilating Matthew's gospel by cutting out its opening chapters. But this is not what Irenaeus says. And we can't claim that he's referring to another Jewish gospel. In the context, he says the Ebionites appropriate Matthew, and Marcion appropriates Luke, and Valentinius appropriates John. He's clearly talking about the canonical gospels. So he just assumes that Matthew is the gospel that the Ebionites prefer. And that's backed up by other patristic writers who have the Ebionites quote Matthew, such as the verse about a disciple imitates his teacher, in why we should imitate Jesus' law observance. So I think the solution here is Origen and Eusebius mention two groups of Ebionites, ones who accept the virgin birth and ones who deny the virgin birth. And that the ones who accept the virgin birth would be partial to Matthew. And of course, you can see why, with Matthew being a gospel, it emphasizes that Jesus didn't come to abolish, but to fulfill the law. And anyone who breaks the least of these commandments will be the least in the kingdom of heaven. I'd like to suggest that maybe the ones that denied the virgin birth might have preferred Mark's gospel, which begins just right with the baptism of Jesus, so no nativity narrative. I think Mark's affinity with the Ebionites is often missed because it's often regarded as a Pauline or a pro-Gentile gospel. So my PhD advisor was James Crossley, so I'll throw a plug in for his view, or you could look at Daniel Boyarin as well. And their arguments that in Mark's gospel, everything Jesus disputes are always with the Pharisees' oral traditions, that not with breaking the commandments. Even reading Mark 7, cleansing all food, not in light of the dietary laws, but in light of the argument about whether unwashed hands can render food unclean, and Jesus challenging that oral tradition. There's another approach to why these two schools, the Ebionites, came about. Luhmann argues that maybe some were reading a text of Irenaeus that said the Ebionites were not like Cerinthus and Carpocrates, and others were reading a text that said they were like Cerinthus and Carpocrates, and thus inventing one set of Ebionites that affirms the virgin birth and ones that deny it. The problem I have with this view is none of the texts before Origen claimed that the Ebionites endorsed the virgin birth. So I don't see this text critical issue of giving rise to these two schools of Ebionites. Rather, I think Origen had personal encounter with Jewish Christ followers and knew that there was a divide between some who affirmed Matthew and the virgin birth and some who did not. So I'll just skip ahead here. With this background in mind, I think Ebionites' Christology and their soteriology and their ethics were all interconnected. in Justin Martyr, the reason Trypho argues that Jesus could be elected to be the Messiah was his perfect obedience to the law. And this seems to be implied by Irenaeus that the Ebionites are like Cerinthus, let's say, because they argue that Jesus was exalted to a higher status as a reward for his righteous behavior. The author of the Refutation says that Jesus was to have been justified by the law, and anyone who acts like Jesus can be justified according to the law and even can become anointed ones. So there's this imitation of Christ theme that kind of undergirds their theology. And of course, that verse in Matthew about a disciple like his teacher is multiply attested in different patristic sources. So this idea that Jesus was a human who, through his covenantal obedience, was exalted to be Messiah, I think was probably a common view among many, not all, but many Jewish Christ followers. It's when we get to Epiphanius that the profile dramatically changes. He notes that the Ebionites were born of Joseph's seed, and the Spirit descended on him at his baptism, though he's kind of confused by Irenaeus because he thinks the Spirit is the Christ aeon, which is more Cerinthus' belief than the Ebionites. And they also keep the law and circumcision and other customs, but everything else changes. Epiphanius' Ebionites view Christ as varyingly an archangel who rules over creation, a being of gigantic proportions, the original Adam, or a pre-existent spirit who became reincarnated in several bodies since Adam, as Moses' prophetic successor who abolished sacrifice. They're not just concerned about Jewish law, but now they are repeatedly engaging in ritual immersions. They're vegetarians. They're forbidding celibacy and allowing remarriage. They're dismissing most of the Hebrew Bibles and most of the Hebrew prophets and all the passages in the Pentateuch that refer to the sacrificial cults. They practice the Eucharist only with water, which can't be related. Irenaeus talks about how the Ebionites refused to mix the water with the heavenly wine, but he's talking about Jesus' divine and human natures, the union of them. He's not referring to this special Eucharist practice where they don't have wine. So I'll skip over a lot of material here, but the reason Epiphanius has such a different picture is that he just has a whole bunch of sources that he thinks the Ebionites are one group, and he assigns them a whole bunch of sources that no one else did before. So these include the circuits of Peter and the ascent of James, so something to do with the pseudo-Clementines. He has a gospel, which looks like a harmony of the synoptic gospels and has its own distinct theology. And he confuses it both with a mutilated copy of Matthew and with the gospel according to the Hebrews, which was a very different text. He has an apocryphal Acts. So I think scholars kind of get misled by Epiphanius a little bit when, they try to say, how did Irenaeus' Ebionites become Epiphanius' Ebionites? And do they have Samaritan or Essene or Elkosite influence? They also have the book of Elksai, by the way, an apocalyptic text. I think Epiphanius tends to just muddle his sources, and he just attributes a whole variety of sources to this group that no one else did. And so he creates this composite picture of the Ebionites. And this fits his polemic because he describes Ebion as a monstrosity with many shapes and a many-headed hydra. So he wants to portray the Ebionites as confused in their Christology and their practice. So I think Joseph Verheiden's verdict on Epiphanius is apt, where he says, in the opinion of modern scholars, he has composed the most confusing survey, an achievement that's not to be underestimated in the field of patristic heresiology. So in light of his penchant for kind of misascribing his sources, it's hard to trust whether the salacious gossip he reports about what the Ebionites said about Paul can be attributed to any of the earlier portraits of the Ebionites that we have. So in this story, we have Paul is a descendant of Greek parents, so he's not Jewish, and he fell in love with the high priest's daughter and wanted to marry her, but because his love was unrequited, he was enraged and turned against the law of Moses. So most would just see this as a typical example of othering in the ancient world. You know, Chaim Maccoby is probably one of the only scholars who lent this story an air of legitimacy and arguing that Paul was not Jewish, but attempted to be a Jewish proselyte. And, you know, his failure to observe the law led him to rebel against the tradition, but most scholars would not go there anymore, including all the participants of this conference. So that's my Epiphanius' picture of the Ebionites. So I'll try to be quicker through the Nazarenes here. When we look at the Nazarenes in Epiphanius, his account of their history is a bit confusing. On the one hand, he says they go right back to the earliest church, that the Jesus followers, including Paul, were known as Nazareans, but then they changed their name to Jessians for a period when they were in Egypt, when Mark the Evangelist was evangelizing, and then some of them became Christians at Antioch, but others remained Nazarenes. But then he says in the same breath that the Nazarenes emerged after the flight to Pella, after 70 CE, and Ebion was a Nazarene and came out of the Nazarenes. So there is a scholar, Pritz, who argues that there's a genuine memory here of the split between the Ebionites and the Nazarenes. I'll come back to that at Pella. Epiphanius gives us a list of their beliefs and practices. So according to him, they value the Old and New Testaments, the corporate resurrection of the dead. They proclaim one creator God and Jesus as his son or servants. They read the scriptures and Matthew's gospel in Hebrew, and they are law observant. They practice circumcision, Sabbath, and other Jewish laws. Epiphanius doesn't know what they believe about the virgin birth or about whether they cut the opening chapters of Matthew's gospel. So he obviously doesn't have firsthand acquaintance with the group where he could get these answers. At first glance, his information seems to be corroborated by Jerome, who is writing a letter to Augustine where he mentions there's these Nazarenes that recite the creed that Jesus is the Christ and Son of God and born of the Virgin Mary and suffered under Pilate before rising again, but yet they're not included as either Jews or Christians, because here he interprets the benediction against Minim as a curse against this Jewish Christian group rather than Christians in general, and a huge area of debate there. But we have to keep in mind Jerome's rhetoric here. He's arguing against Augustine, and Augustine was trying to refute Jerome's position that Jerome had wrote a commentary on Galatians and claimed that Peter and Paul were only pretending to fight over table fellowship to teach the Jewish and non-Jewish Christ followers how to get along. Augustine said, you know, that how dare he say that Peter and Paul were acting, rather it was okay for a time for Peter and other Jewish Christ followers to maintain their cultural customs. And Jerome is rebutting him by saying, it's not okay to maintain Jewish and Christian identities, because here's this example, the Nazarenes who try to do so and they're rejected by both communities. So it's Jerome, part of this letter is Jerome's rhetoric. And so we have to be careful about that. But usually Jerome is more positive towards the Nazarenes. He cites their commentary on Isaiah repeatedly, which seems to be a commentary that's deeply engaged with rabbinic authorities. And he cites their gospel, which the majority of scholars will classify as the gospel of the Nazarenes. I take a minority view that the gospel of Nazarenes did not exist, and so sometimes Jerome is citing older Greek traditions about the gospel according to Hebrews, and sometimes he's citing the Nazarenes' version of Matthew that they gave him. So their own kind of retranslation of Matthew's gospel. But, you know, otherwise we have this sense that we have this group that basically has Christology shared by the wider Gentile Christ followers and the same scriptures, and that some of them want to keep the Torah. So in terms of scholarship, some scholars claim that here we have a Jewish group by the 4th century who was making their peace with the Catholic Church. Others claim that they have this long history. The problem with that is before Epiphanius and Jerome, the sources are silent on the Nazarenes. you know, we have these earlier references to two schools of the Ebionites, but, you know, they don't quite line up with the Nazarenes. So both, for Origen, both schools of Ebionites hate Paul. For Eusebius, both schools of Ebionites deny the pre-existence of Jesus. For Justin, we have two groups of Jewish Christians that fight over whether Gentiles can keep the law, but he's silent about whether they like Paul or not. So I think it's precarious to read back the Nazarenes into these earlier conflicts. I'm persuaded that, you know, the Nazarenes, it's probably a title that was used by a wider variety of non-Greek and non-Latin speaking Jesus followers who didn't adopt the Greek title Christian. Now, with that said, Epiphanius and Jerome might have known some Jewish believers that also identified as Nazarenes, but Epiphanius's attempt to give them a history, he just takes from the book of Acts and Eusebius's ecclesiastical history. So you can compare what Acts says about the Jerusalem church's Christology, or what Eusebius says about the flight to Pella and where the Ebionites are located, and that's what Epiphanius says about the Nazarenes. So conclusion, I think there's probably a diverse variety of Jewish Christians, and it's the patristic writers who try to label these groups as single schools that they call Ebionites and Nazarenes. And they have a variety of views towards Paul. On the one hand, one popular Jewish view was that because Jesus was Torah observant and was exalted to be a Messiah, so all his followers, Jew and non-Jewish alike, are expected to observe the Torah likewise. And this group, or people that held this view, did not like Paul. They regarded him as an apostate from the law. There were other Jewish Christians that we hear about in the 4th century that made their peace between having a Torah observant lifestyle and embracing Paul's mission to the nations. So in the Nazarenes' commentary on Isaiah, they mentioned that Paul multiplied the gospel throughout the world. So what this says to me is that Paul is amenable to being understood as either antinomian or nomian. And perhaps that is why we are debating whether Paul is within Judaism today. So on that note, I'll hand it over to you and get some feedback.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Yeah, it's a good topic. Yeah, I've been doing a bit of reading up on these Ebionites too, and there's a whole mass of issues, text critical. What texts are they talking about? Are they talking about the same text with different names? And I sometimes wonder whether Epiphanius is just making stuff up, to be honest, because he seems to attribute every heresy to every group, as far as I can tell. So I find it very difficult to follow. But Lyn, you have the first right of reply, or any comments or questions for Michael?
Yeah. So when I was listening to your presentation, Michael, seems to me that we have like a stream of Christianity that's not relying on Paul, which the stream of Christianity that does rely on Paul is suspicious about. But I don't know what you think about that. But also, I mean, both you and I are talking a lot about, you know, Judaism or Jewishness. And Paul himself seems to vanish in a way, and well, particularly his Judaism. So whether you're dealing with people who are calling themselves Ebionites or Nazarenes, they don't seem to think that Paul is Jewish enough. But then on the other hand, people over in the Pauline camp seem to be downplaying Paul's Jewishness as well. Is that the way you're reading it?
Yeah, it's interesting comparing our two papers. Like, so in your paper, some Christians are downplaying Paul's Jewish identity, right? And you're trying to construct boundaries on the Christian side and inappropriate Paul on that side. While, you know, in my paper, it's the Ebionites' perception that Paul had left his Jewish tradition customs that created the problem. And they were trying to maybe I wonder in trying to spread their message to other Jewish communities, Paul himself was the liability, you know, his perception that he left his ancestral traditions and was encouraging others to do so. So they'd rather, you know, push Paul away. So yeah, it's interesting how Paul kind of, or these different understandings of Paul for how these groups want to kind of socially construct their identity in opposition to other groups, or, you know, engagement with other groups. Yeah, well, it's unfortunate for the Jewish Christian Nazoraeans, because even where they can embrace Paul and have the same canon, they also are choked out because in the processes of trying to have, like, I think of Daniel Boyarin's image about the borderlines being constructed in the 4th century, these middle hybrid groups are getting choked because they occupy that middle space that's seen as, you know, not too much like, they want to have this us, them, and these kind of these groups disrupt that. And so, yeah, they don't survive.
Because I think that's probably what Phineas is doing, isn't he? He's trying to make sure there's hard boundaries. There's us and there's those folks over there. So, which is perhaps the reason why he might be making stuff up.
Yeah,
as Mike said, constructing histories and stuff, because he's trying to. He's not too sure about them either, and they're hard to classify. So we just give them a Genesis so we can classify them.
Yeah, no, I think every time I deal with Epiphanius, like I've written on Cerinthus too, and the way Epiphanius does that is he sees Irenaeus connecting Cerinthus to the Ebionites, and therefore that's his license to bring the Cerinthus into every battle in the New Testament over Peter and Paul and the Gentile mission, and he's even in 1 Corinthians denying. So yeah, he probably is pretty careless with the sources, but his effort is probably, yeah, to shore up the identity of his community, right? And to, he's not trying to be fairly engaging these groups, he's polemicizing so that he can shore up his own boundaries.
Yeah,
against
I
them.
think so. But it's interesting. I've lost it. Which group was it that didn't have wine at the Eucharist? They had water, which is how they in the story about Thecla is how they celebrate the Eucharist as well. So perhaps these groups, you know, many of them had the same kind of traditions, but they were on opposing signs, or they had, overlapping traditions.
Yeah.
But they are all ready to call each other, like distance themselves from each other.
Yeah.
So it makes it hard. I mean, I think we have to have a little bit of sympathy for Phineas, because maybe it's just really hard to tell who's who, because they have overlapping traditions anyway.
Yeah, that comes from Epiphanius too, the water to wine. And that's a good point. Like, I think, you know, he's preserving a lot of these texts. And I do think there probably was Jewish Christian groups who, you know, accepted Jesus as Davidic Messiah, and others behind the pseudo-Clementines that he was the prophet like Moses. And then you had the Elkosite movement where they were claiming to have a new baptism and were promoting the book of Elkosite. So these probably were all Jewish Christ followers adopting these various positions. Epiphanius's problem is he thinks they're all the one same group, right? So he ends up creating this conflated picture that no one group held, and it's just a very confusing, but that works with his account to discredit them.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, as I was listening to both papers, I was reminded about, was it Acts 21, where James takes Paul aside and says, you know, Paul, you've got a bit of a PR issue. Everyone says you're teaching Jews not to obey the law and you've abandoned the law themselves. It sounds like the Paul of the martyrologies and the Ebionites Paul both agree that the accusation was correct, and one group says that's a good thing, another group says that's a bad thing. But they both seem to accept the verdict that Paul was teaching a non-Jewish, at least, practice.
Yeah, no, I think it goes back really early. So we have to deal with that aspect of the reception history of Paul. But in point to a favorite of Paul within Judaism is, at least by 4th century, we do hear Jewish believers that have managed to reconcile Torah way of observant way of life with Paul's mission to the nations, or whoever wrote that commentary on Isaiah did. So I guess that sets that precedent too. And Gager's survey covers other earlier stuff that would give precedent for. So I guess these debates were happening in the ancient world as well as today at our conference.
Indeed, indeed. Well, on that note, I think it's time for a break. I think we'll take a 15-minute break to refresh ourselves. After that, I think we can then have a bit of a discussion on matters that have arisen. So I've got a few questions simmering over, which I'll be very glad to share with people. Otherwise, I'll see you all in about 15 minutes. Well, we're now at the discussion or Q&A session of the Paul Within Judaism Symposium. I thought I'd kick off with a group question and to see what people think of this. I've done a bit of work with N.T. Wright, and generally agreeable with a lot of things he's doing, particularly how Paul reconfigures the Jewish worldview around Jesus. On some issues, I'd probably be maybe a tad more Protestant, but on other issues, I'm certainly more with the Paul Within Judaism school. And I know one of the differences that Tom and I have is on the question, if Paul had a son, would he have circumcised him? Now, Tom tends to lean towards the answer no, whereas I'm inclined to say yes, I think Paul would have. So I'd be very interested to hear from the corporate brains trust if there is a general position on this. If Paul had a son, would he have circumcised him? Which I think illustrates how Paul saw him and his own relationship to Judaismos and what we would call the wider Jewish tradition. So who would be in favor of Paul circumcising his son if he had one, just out of curiosity? Maybe do we have the show of hands sort of a thing? Yeah, sorry, when I said show of hands, I actually meant the response button, but that's okay. We can employ a literal hermeneutic here if we like. Okay, that's interesting. And who would be opposed to the idea, or who would not think that Paul would circumcise a son if he had one?
Did Tom explain to you why why Paul wouldn't circumcise his son?
I think it's because circumcision is bound up with the old creation. So it's part of the things that are fading away, and it's also the sign of there's a new sign and signifier for belonging to God's people in the sort of Tom wouldn't use the language, but the sort of the dispensation of the new creation. It's sort of faith and baptism are the new signs of belonging to God people, which is not to say you need to kind of reverse circumcision or anything. But it's no longer the marker of showing that you belong to God's people. It's part of the old age.
So it's Paul and the faithlessness of God. Maybe.
That's definitely not what Tom would say. But I can understand how some people would get that critique. Well, but does anyone want to speak back to that on maybe why Paul wouldn't circumcise his son?
Maybe it would depend on the opinion of the mother of this boy. Or to put it in another way, what sort of woman could you imagine Paul would marry? Would it be a member of his churches in Corinth, for instance? Would he marry a Gentile woman as long as she would be a member of one of her churches?
It would have to be a very patient woman, for one thing. And Krister always said that there were good reasons why Paul wasn't married, and it wasn't principled asceticism. I think Krister is probably right.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've also got the issue if Paul did marry a non-Gentile, you've also got the issue of his Jewish identity through the father, through the mother, those sorts of dates. I remember Shay Cohen writing something about this some years ago.
Identity of the child usually follows in the early Roman period the social identity of the father, and that's also true in biblical Judaism. And the question is, when is the inflection point for rabbinic matrilineal descent? And it's not clear.
Yeah, so I mean that's a complicating factor. I know my colleague Brian has written on Paul and the law. I mean, Brian, do you have an opinion on this topic?
I'm leaning towards Tom, to be honest. I think Paul has said such negative things about circumcision. I mean, he says 3 times circumcision is nothing, and he juxtaposes it with faith working through love. What are the other ones? The other one is keeping the commandments of God, which I don't regard, by the way, as keeping the Mosaic commandments, because if you look at the other 2, what he juxtaposes or opposes against circumcision is not keeping the law of Moses, it's something else. So I think it's a replacement motif. Yeah, I'd have to think more about it, but I can see why Tom would go that way. Well, it's the new creation, isn't it? Is it in 2 Corinthians 5 that keeping circumcision is nothing but a new creation? Yeah. So just on the basis of those texts, you can imagine him making that argument.
Well, I'd push back, Brian, and say Paul treats circumcision as a positive thing because he says we are the circumcision, even for those who are not circumcised. And when he's talking to, I think, a Jewish audience or addressing a Jewish position in Romans 3, he says, what is the advantage of circumcision? And he says, much in every way. I don't think he's applying that to Gentiles, but I think in terms of the Jewish covenant, he's saying, whether you want to say this is, merely in the past, but there is a sense in which circumcision remains a positive thing for Jews.
Go ahead, Paula.
No, Ryan has just written copiously about this, and I wondered he's read up on all this, and I just wondered, Ryan, if you have something you'd want to observe.
And there's a couple of other hands up too, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, in regards to what were you thinking, Paul, in regards to Paul circumcising his son, or was there any particular thought you had in mind?
Circumcision and foreskins.
You are now the official voice on Philippians 3:1 through whatever, so you must speak.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to get off topic too much, but and this I think ties into the question of how does Paul categorize these ex-pagan Gentiles, and are they included in the identity of Israel or not? But I think, Mike, you just said this, and I think Jörg cited it, and I think it came up a couple other times in other papers. But the whole "we are the circumcision" thing, and these other categories of "we are the circumcision" or Romans 2:28-29, is Paul redefining or redirecting what circumcision is, or what it counts for, who it applies to? And I would just say emphatically no. And this goes with including Gentiles amongst the people of Israel as well. So in particularly Philippians 3:3, we are the circumcision. I wonder why we think that has to include non-Jews. Like, what's the signifier in the text that says it looks to everybody, and not just Paul and Timothy, the Jewish authors of the letter? The rhetorical function of it, he lays it out, the dogs, the wicked workers, the mutilation. He's setting up this juxtaposition between these opposing agitators and the authors of the letter. So they come claiming to be the circumcision, when actually me and Timothy, the ones who worship by the Spirit, do not boast in the flesh, we actually are the circumcision. So I guess I just want to push back against the general tendency to redefine these categories and these terms, when Paul traditionally, as Josh Dipp pointed out, when he talks about Israel, he means Israel. So why in Romans 9:6 or 11:26 does it have to be expansive when everywhere else he doesn't expand it? Or with the circumcision and foreskins, why in these two instances do we have, in Philippians and Romans 2, do we have to include foreskinned people under the category of the circumcision? So yeah, that's kind of my general thought.
Well, my response to that, maybe I'm now referring back to Tom's view, is that, correct me if I'm wrong, but Paul regards circumcision as something that can be imputed. And I think he talks about peritome logizestai, something that can be imputed either as a status or an equivalent. In Philippians 3, I think you've got the we are the circumcision, then becomes the grounds as to why the group does not need to be circumcised should some of these sort of Galatian intruders make an appearance in Philippi. I don't think any sort of opponents have turned up to Philippi. And then you've also got the fact that there is a tradition of kind of spiritualizing circumcision that you find in Philo, in the migration of Abraham, and all the way in the biblical tradition of circumcision of the heart. So I think you can argue that circumcision in a non-literal way can become a sort of an honorific term of in-group identity, even for people who don't have it. But I know you've probably forgotten more about this than I know. So I'll happily hand back to you, Brian.
Yeah. I think you can read it that way. I just don't think you should read it that way. And obviously there is that a long history or a tradition in the Hebrew Bible of circumcision of the heart. I won't deny that. But in all those instances, the heart circumcision reflects the penile circumcision. It's in addition to, it's not a replacement of. And obviously our words have been a theme for the conference. What do we like? Replacement, reprioritization, relativization, whatever. I'm not a fan of most of those. But I think, I wonder if we could just, sometimes we're reading Paul's treatment of these things with later Gentile Christian authors in the back of our minds without really thinking about it. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks for that, Ryan.
Mike.
Sorry, who's talking?
That's me, Lyn.
Oh, hey, Lyn.
I was just going to say, in Pauline tradition, he does have a son. He adopts Timothy. So in the Pastoral Epistles, Timothy is his son, and my conclusion was that it's more than just fictive language. He really is has really adopted Timothy as his son. And in that tradition, as we know from Acts, he circumcises Timothy because he has a Jewish mother and grandmother.
I'd never thought of that.
So there's the answer, I think. Well, at least it's the answer from the Pauline tradition as we have it in the New Testament.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I have to tell you, when I think of this topic, I once had Andreas Blaschke's book Beschneidung on my desk, and a female student came into my office and she said, "What is this book about?" And she literally opened it up to the only page that has pictures, and she found out very, very abruptly what the book was about, and then she kind of put it back down and said she wished she'd never picked it up. So that's what I think about every time I come across this topic.
Yeah, I think Joshua has a
I can't see anyone's hands.
Contribution to make too.
Okay, if you need to, I need you to put your hands up on the not physically on the screen, but on the reaction app.
Yeah, I did that. You didn't see me though.
I did.
See, Joshua was doing both now.
Is he doing both? Okay. Okay, well, you may just need to have to go to the loudest voice rule, since it normally comes up on the bottom of my screen, but it's not coming up now. Josh, you've got a comment or a question?
Sure, I guess a little of both. And by the way, I have an interesting story too. I was once giving a talk at Pepperdine University, which is the most beautiful place in the world. and it was about circumcision. And at one point, a young lady raised her hand and said, well, what's circumcision? And I said, oh, well, like removing the foreskin from the penis. I was trying to be very, technical about it. And she said, well, what does that mean? And the discussion just went downhill from there very quickly. And I have never been asked back to Pepperdine. So this is an uncomfortable topic sometimes in certain settings, but not here. So I voted for Paul not circumcising his child, although I think it's a much more complicated issue than that. And here's why. On the one hand, I would say, why would Paul circumcise his child? If the traditional answer, the reason I circumcised my kids, is the belief that that is what introduces them into the covenant of Israel, I don't think that that's what Paul believed. I think that people were introduced into the covenant of Israel through faith and pneuma, and that was demonstrated by fulfilling the dikaiomata of the law, and that is what makes you circumcised. In the same way that a bad Jew, as he says in Romans 2, it's as if his circumcised penis gets reversed. So likewise, if the uncircumcised person does what he thinks they ought to do, their uncircumcised penis is reversed. So for many reasons, I don't think he would. But I think the issue of infants in and of themselves raises a big problem for our understanding of Paul. And I find it fascinating that Paul never mentions it, because if for Paul, what introduces you into the covenant is either pistis or what does he say? Expressing with your lips and believing in your heart and all of that stuff. These are things that presumably only adults can do. And so the very idea of a baby that is not able to express a pistis, I don't know what Paul would have done with that. And I think that's fascinating. But well, I think that's the problem, is the fact that a baby can't opine. It's not that the baby is or is not a part of the Jewish covenant, which I don't think he thinks is dependent on circumcision any longer. So that's my complicated response.
Okay, very interesting. I'd have to say, as a committed pedo-Baptist, that the faith of the parent stands as a surrogate for the faith of the child. I can't guarantee that David Starling will agree with me on that one, but I'm sure Murray will be with me in a very strong sense. But no, thanks, Josh. I mean, that's a good response to that kind of issue.
I've always wondered why in 1 Thessalonians, when the people are freaking out that their grandparents are dying, and in the ancient world probably their parents too, but that no one ever, as far as I know, asks about infants or people before the age of reason, however we would say that now.
Yeah, but would that be just because of the genuine attitude towards infants? Because in some cultures, infants are not interesting until they kind of, get to about, 7 or 8. Until then, they're almost like either non-people or at best potential people. Or is it because it's not just part of the, people are worried about grandparents dying, but they're not really worried about that the status of the children is just assumed, that it's kind of taken up into the household itself. So yeah, that's the question I have.
If that's the case, then all the more so I would say he would not circumcise the child. Why change someone the way they are? That seems to be his attitude in 1 Corinthians.
I think Murray's got a question, no doubt in defense of paedo-baptism.
Oh yeah, just a small comment on that, where Paul does talk about children in 1 Corinthians 7. And he talks about the children of believing parents being holy, which you could make a case that's covenantal language. They belong in the covenant. And if we admit Ephesians, bring the children up in the training and instruction of the Lord, Ephesians 6, then you've got an assumption that the children are being raised in the covenant. So I think Paul would see children of believing parents as in the covenant without the necessity of circumcision.
Thanks for that, Murray. I believe, Paula, you had your hand raised as well.
Right. Instead of speculating about what Paul doesn't say, we could look at what Paul does say, which is that the end is upon everybody. He's not thinking in a 2-generation model. And he doesn't say to the Thessalonians, don't worry about people dying. He's saying, no, it's all on track. It's all going to happen fast. The Redeemer will descend. There'll be the sound of the trumpet. The archangel will come. He's saying things are still on time. So the reason he's not thinking about a second generation is because he's not expecting one.
Yeah, but what does he do with the status of children now? Even if he doesn't think these children will ever grow up, does he think that they still have a status now, or they need some kind of care and concern in the present time, however short it may be?
He doesn't talk about children, and basically, I don't want to keep pivoting to Gentile foreskins and Jewish circumcision, but he doesn't even talk about women very much, right? He's, like most Mediterranean first century males, concerned about the public ritual behavior of other males. So if he's not concerned about integrating women, he will say something as that nice balance in 1 Corinthians 7, but then he goes on about what to do with your Parthenos. He's not a detail guy. And we also have 7 letters, many of which are co-authored, none of which is, in terms of manuscript tradition, goes back before the 2nd century. I don't know what Paul, I mean, for all we know, he had a whole letter about how to circumcise your kid if you were a Jewish Christ follower, and we just don't have the letter.
Well,
we don't know.
That definitely would be a good one if anyone can dig it up somewhere. Who knows? I mean, they still need to dig up Colossae. Maybe you can find it in Colossae one day. Josh, Jeff, you've got a question.
Yeah, it's not. I guess I'm still answering your question, Mike. And back to the text, one of the texts you quoted, Romans 3:1. I mean, this is one of the things I often wonder around these conversations, and I think I've mentioned it a couple of times. It seems as though Paul says that what matters in Romans 2:28 and 29 is whether a Jew, an Ebionites, has been circumcised in the heart. That's the Jew that will receive praise from God at the day of judgment. So then the question that the interlocutor or whoever asks in 3:1, what then is the advantage of the Jew, or what then is the benefit of circumcision, seems to me to be drawn right from him basically privileging, what really matters is circumcision of the heart, but nevertheless, literal, circumcision is necessary as a sign of basically God's covenant faithfulness and his election of Israel. So I guess the point I'm getting at is, at times, is the question more difficult than, would Paul circumcise his son or would he not? Should Jews still be circumcised? To me, that answer seems to be yes, but that what Paul ultimately thinks is of significance, but that circumcision at the end of the day, as far as the argument goes in Romans 1-3, is not going to give you basically any sort of eschatological escape card when the wrath of God is revealed. That's going to be dependent upon something that's more significant, which is the circumcision of the heart. So I guess I would want to answer yes, he would still circumcise his son. Ultimately, and I don't know how you get away from Romans 3:1 being that, but ultimately, what that's a symbol of, or ultimately is of higher value, is whether or not there's the circumcision of the heart in 2:29. So, and last comment is, if you think Paul wouldn't circumcise his son, I guess for me, as the one who gave one of the papers on the Luke and Paul, obviously, at least I think the Luke and Paul would want to say that would be problematic. So if Luke's voice can come in.
So problematic in the sense of him doing it or not doing it?
That I don't see how you can read, unless Luke is, unless we're not to trust Luke's depiction of Paul, that all of the claims that Paul basically makes to be Torah observant, faithful to the law, taking the Nazaritic vow, going to the temple cult, all of those sorts of things, all of those seem to me at face value to indicate that, if Paul had a son, he would circumcise him.
And by the way, Josh, I'd agree with that. If the question was, would the Lucan Paul have circumcised his son, I'd say absolutely, which may give you an indication of what I think of the Lucan Paul. But
yeah, no, yeah, I can obviously see you have a conflict between the two. I actually think they're a little bit closer together on this issue, but I see we disagree on that.
Did you re-raise your hand, or is that still up from the last session?
I re-raised my hand, but if there's somebody else with a hand up who hasn't been called on yet, I certainly will wait.
I think your hand was the only one raised there, so you have the floor.
Oh, thank you. If I'm trying to remember all the R words that Josh Garraway ran us through. If Paul reformats, reconfigures, what can you remember the rest of them? I mean, it was like a rap song.
recalibrate was a popular one.
Blah blah blah. If he did, what makes you think this is a conference about Paul within Judaism? Right?
Is that a question for Josh or Ron?
Everybody. What are we talking about?
Well, I would answer that what we're trying to figure out is what it means to be within, to me at least, the interesting question is what it means to be within Judaism. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Anybody else?
Everyone want to chime in on that? What I mean, that's probably good. Would have been a good one to open. Is what do we mean by Paul within Judaism? We've got.
I'm looking at Jorg's paper. I'm so sorry that he's so beleaguered with teaching, which is an occupational hazard. It's on page 2 of his paper in the middle paragraph. He talks first about John Gager, who's John Gager is a Sonderweg person. I'm not. And then Jorg goes on to say, scholars of the Paul within Judaism school are no longer solely concerned with understanding and locating the apostle within pluriform contemporary, meaning first century Jewishness. Rather, Jewish scholars such as Mark Nanas or Paula Fredrickson programmatically attempt to deny the relevance of Paul's statements for contemporary and later Judaism, then skipping to his final clause. The political effect of this view, or even the aim of the views mentioned, is to delegitimize any further Christian critique of Judaism. And then he has a footnote to also a number of scholars from the Scandinavian school, which I'd also like to ethnically be considered part of. So that's one definition of what it means to have Paul within Judaism.
Although he has 3 question marks after Scandinavian school.
That's because he didn't have time to put the footnotes in. Come on.
Would the Scandinavian school be scholars like, was that, if I get the name correct, Anders Runeson? Did I get that correct?
Well, you could go with the heroic generation of Munch, Dahl, and Stendhal.
Ah, okay.
Runeson and Zetterholm and Karen Zetterholm. And I think there were, I listed something like 11 scholars who were not of the Jewish persuasion in footnote number 7 of my paper. And Rune Thorsteinsson is Icelandic. So is that technically Scandinavia? Probably. Yeah, I mean, that's the, Jorg gave us one definition of what it means to have a Paul within Judaism position. It means to delegitimize Christian critiques of Judaism.
I think Jorg would say that's the only aspect or the only element of the sort of Paul within Judaism. I'm sure he'd have well, he's not here. I don't want to speak for him, but I think there are other, like one of the frustrations I've heard from scholars is the idea, or this is not everyone within the Paul within Judaism, but the idea that Jesus is the Messiah for Gentiles, but not for Jews. Now, I'm thinking in particular of Pamela Eisenbaum's thesis, where sort of Judaism is kind of left intact, and Jesus as Messiah is simply the instrument for Gentile inclusion. I think many scholars don't find that a plausible way of reading Paul, and certain things that have gone under the moniker of Paul within Judaism seem to have been presented a perspective something along those lines. I know Marcus has had up his hand. Marcus had his hand up very patiently. So, Mark, do you want to chime in?
Sure, I'll come in on that. I actually was wanting to come in before that, but I'll come in on that because, like I suggested to Jorg regarding the audience profile, this is another misrepresentation. I mean, yes, you can probably find somebody, like you can probably find some text somewhere in all of Jewish history that confirms what you'd like to make your straw man. But besides Pamela, I'm not sure there's another Paul within Judaism person of the modern, Gager, Stowers, Gaston, they precede this move. They're happening at the same time as the new perspective was developing. And they were developing that. And I think they were developing that because they were, in my opinion, they were accepting a lot of the standard Christian translations, as I believe Josh is in his construction and others. And if you accept those, then you run into some of these, well, I would say problems that you have to negotiate some way. And they negotiated it that way. But Paula and myself and everybody that's in the book, Paul within Judaism, and I think Kidson and Novason and now Coleman and Brian Tucker and so on, none of us that I know of hold that view. So it really is a straw man to take that as a major concern. All of us think Paul is, well, I mean, we have our various views, but I think all of us would say Paul thinks Jesus is a Messiah, is a truth claim that his fellow Israelites should agree to. And he's trying to understand, to some degree, he's not the most understanding guy. He's trying to understand why they haven't yet. And he's trying to provoke the non-Jews to behave Jewishly, so it demonstrates to his fellow Jews that there is something to this and they really need to give it a thought. But his fellow Jews don't have a revelation. And, Paul didn't come to this because of arguments, because of scripture or because of the witness of non-Jews. He says he has a revelation. And if these other Jews don't have that, I mean, Paul, I don't think he's so impractical that he doesn't realize that, culpability here has to be fairly low. You're getting this probably secondhand. You're getting rumors. It doesn't necessarily make sense that some Judean guy has changed and brought the end of the ages, since empirically nothing has changed. And so if fellow Jews who are faithful to the covenant, and especially if they're hearing that these groups, through rumors and through those who want to cast a bad light on them, are saying, well, yeah, they're saying circumcision doesn't matter and so on and so forth, then naturally other Jews who want to be faithful to what's, let's call it normative Judaism, if you will, broadly, they're not going to be interested in this. And so Paul has to wrestle with it. And I don't think any of us think he isn't doing that, and that he doesn't think that ideally all of his fellow Jews will come to some conclusion like this. Although in my own view, I'm sort of developing another sort of way to understand what I think he's saying, but it still is not that he doesn't think this is a truth claim that his fellow Jews. And also the other problem I have with the two covenant or Zonderweg view, that I don't know that it's been really articulated that well. I've been trying to the last few years. It starts from a Christian presupposition about salvation, that Torah saves or something else saves instead of Jesus, which is not really, I don't think that's a very normative Jewish premise, that there's any need for salvation. Torah doesn't save. I mean, it can save if we use save to protect, to keep you safe, to keep you what Sanders would call, to stay in. But believing in Torah is not how you get in. So it's not it seems to me that the Zondervan view is based on accepting Christian premises and trying to turn them upside down, which I really deeply appreciate, but I don't agree with. And so those scholars, let me just stop there. Those scholars who are wrestling with this are wrestling with a straw man.
Thanks, Emma. I think that's an important point, that the Paul within Judaism, I don't want to say shula, but cohort or gathering in the broader sense, is not coterminous with the Sonderweg view. I think that is a something that's been attached by reputation, assuming that you're the inheritors of Gage and Gaston, which has been, I think, wrongly attached to the movement. So I'm certainly aware of that. I think you do make the good question whether a lot of this is thinking about things in Christian categories. I mean, why do we assume that a religion of grace is better than a religion of works? That kind of thing. I mean, that's just proof that you're operating in sort of Protestant coordinates.
Right.
On the issue of, I mean, Paul opines that the Jews don't have the revelation of Jesus Christ, but he still says some things that make it sound like he wishes they did. For example, in Romans 1, he talks about the gospel being for the Jew first, then for the Gentile. And then you get 2 Corinthians 3, where he uses this language where he really wants the epistrepho. He hopes, at least for the epistrepho of many of his own Jewish compatriots, that they would be able to have this revelation and they would have the light of Christ shine upon them. So I don't think I don't want to say that Paul just opines they don't have a revelation. I think he does kind of offer a few measures that he would like to make it happen.
If I might just come back on that, because again, here we have to fill in what we presuppose that the reason why he wants them to believe in Jesus as Messiah. I mean, if they're Jews, and this is the truth claim, and this is the awaited age moment, and if their responsibility is to be the herald to the nations, and in order for this to culminate in fullness, instead of just have barely begun and not be very apparent except by their lives in the Spirit demonstrating the proposition, then of course he wants them to get on board. Of course he's distraught that they're not. This can't happen without them getting on board. And they're not going to get on board unless these Gentiles get convinced not only to be righteous, but to be generous towards these Jews, and therefore not break this apart in the direction that it went, because they'll never be. And that's what the jealousy, his ministry to make them jealous is about, that they would stop and say, wow, there might be something to this. And then more of them, if you read that, the metaphors that he's dealing with, the stumbling, falling behind, will catch back up, and then we'll have the resurrection. I mean, this is like it's zero-sum thinking, unfortunately, which Judaism and Christianity and Islam and probably all religions are stuck with. But he's trying to work out of this zero-sum some way to understand this anomalous moment, right? And he's not condemning. I mean, what he's trying to tell these non-Jews in Romans 11 is don't condemn them. And in 14 and 15, in my view, don't piss them off, or they won't really consider this. They'll blaspheme the God that you're claiming. And instead of considering this as a great moment of God's graciousness to the nations that's taking place differently than expected. But let me show you the scriptures, how you could find this in the scriptures and go this way. And so, yeah, he's deeply grieved. But the question is about what? Is it them to be saved in the Christian model? Or is it to be kept safe and to do their job in the Jewish eschatological model? That's a possible way to fill this in and to understand his grief and perplexity that this is the way it's unfolding. And by the way, it's not, of course, by the Jews rejecting and then the Gentiles, but the Jews believing like him, sort of divided. I think Acts has a good, Yerval's reading of Acts is a divided kind of people. And then as the Gentiles come in and they act so Jewish and leave their idols and love Jews and blah, 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 the other Jews come back around. That's the anomaly, but the way his strategy and tactics for what he's doing.
Thanks for that, Mark. I want to open up to a few people. I know, how about we go Brian, Joshua, and then Michael. So over to you first, Brian.
I mean, that was this Brian and not the more important Brian. So when Paul asked that question, I had to turn my camera off and run to get my paper, because I had my original paper, which was 32 pages long. I had asked myself that question. So and I wrote something that's very similar to what we've actually been talking about. And so in asking why we're doing this in this symposium, I mean, really, so there is this kind of first part, which is to clarify what Judaism means. I mean, so this is, other people are obviously doing that, came up a couple different places, but that part seems to be why we're doing this. The second part, obviously we can't keep all the doors open, right? There has to be at least maybe some core to that. But I think for me, the basic significance of the Within Judaism framework is that our view is brought into focus so that we're not arguing in an anti-Jewish way. So I think that's part of, if I was understanding what Jorg was saying, maybe hopefully I understood that in that way. So that's a part that animates for me. And then the third part, which is just kind of came out here, is that Paul continues to have a concern for his people, and it remains at the heart of his activities and his writings, whether these Jews are in Christ or not. And so that doesn't change his concern. So in the end, he would give up his own being in Christ if that were to benefit his people, his own people, in Romans 9:3. And so I think then I would kind of finish off that question from Paul and saying that obviously, and I think all of us agree with that, is that this is not an irrelevant question, right? This is a deeply relevant question, whether Paul remained in Judaism or not. And so that was just my kind of earlier reflections on what we were doing. And so thanks for that question, because it reminded me that I had actually thought about it.
Joshua?
Yeah, so I actually wanted to come back to Jörg's quotation too, that Paula brought up, because I was actually just stunned that Paula mentioned that and then introduced it as a possible definition of the field, because when I read this originally, I thought, and gosh, I wish Jörg was here, but I thought he was criticizing the Paul Within Judaism field by saying that, suggesting that this is not, the great crime of historians to have some overarching political interest that is actually guiding your conclusions instead of raw history. And I thought that's what he was saying, that what the Paul Within Judaism school really is, to put it very bluntly, is Christians who feel bad about the history of Christian anti-Semitism and Jews who want Paul to not be anti-Jewish, and so therefore are reading with that political aim to make Paul say that. That's what I thought he was saying, and maybe I'm misunderstanding him, or maybe I'm misunderstanding the way Paul was understanding him.
That's what I thought too, Mark.
Yeah, speaking. And if that's what he's saying, I guess is that something the Paul Within Judaism scholars would accept? that it's much more about the political aim or even religious aim of the readings and not about the historical?
Can I just
So
jump in?
obviously Paula should respond because I asked her about her reading of that paragraph. If that's okay to bypass Michael.
Much easier if I weren't doing history, right? I mean,
What's that?
Messy inscriptions, all the amulets, all the papyri, I mean, doing Paul within Judaism isn't finding a match between an Old Testament text and something Paul says, right? That's not doing history. Doing history is looking at the soup of first century Mediterranean Greco-Roman culture. And if I were, I mean, and frankly, yeah, anti-Semitism spoils my day. I don't think it's good for, I think it's terrible for Jews. I mean, 10 years before I was born, European Jews were murdered cheerfully. So I have no problem saying out front that I think anti-Semitism is one of the most repulsive consequences of Christian theology. But I thought what Jörg was saying was what you said. I mean, he was saying that it's ideologically, that this work is ideologically rather than historically driven. I don't, of course, he's not an author.
You are the consummate historian, Paula. I was by no means suggesting that's not the case. It was just shocking to me that you would sort of embrace the idea that there is in fact an ideological agenda that is shaping what you're doing. That may be what we all should just be honest about and admit.
I can't make Paul a Philo-Semite or an anti-Semite because those weren't, he was pre-19th century European. He was pre-4th century, right? I mean, that wasn't his issue.
It's such a pity Jörg is not here. I know he's indisposed at the moment. I really wish he was. Look, I mean, if I can try speak in his, not me in his defense, or try to understand where he's coming from, would it be fair to say that there are some elements of the Paul within Judaism most broadly are bound up with particular ideas of both religion, ancient and modern? I'm going for a more a pluralistic view of this. Let me give an example from my own research. I remember the debates about, was ancient Judaism a missionary religion? I don't know if you're familiar with some of those debates. And if you look at it, it was kind of somewhat peculiar, with different Jewish scholars taking different views. Some Jewish scholars, I thought, were having the perspective that, hey, look, Judaism is just as missionary as you Protestants. So, so don't look down on us for being a sort of a partisan, parochial particulars. We're just as missionary as the best Protestant organization. And then I felt like you had some Jewish scholars were saying, the only thing I would ever convert would be my loft. So, I mean, you had these like different attitudes towards conversion, which I do wonder did influence, I think, the way they understood the evidence about whether converting people from other religion is a good thing or a bad thing. I could see that perspective sort of seeping into the way they tackled the topic of ancient Jewish missionary activity. I think Jörg may be concerned if there's a similar thing going on. Certainly some of the discussions of supersessionism, I would say, do touch on the issue of things like religious pluralism in its contemporary manifestation. Now, I'm not necessarily thinking that's, based on what Marcus said, that certainly may not be an issue for the group here, but in wider discussions of Paul within Judaism, supersessionism, the kind of religious pluralistic question has kind of come up. And religious pluralism can have diverse expressions about how you have a multicultural and multi-faith society in the 20th and 20th century. But one thing I certainly would agree with Paula is, anti-Semitism, you have to say, is the most successful ideology of the 20th century, because it gets people from the extreme political left and the extreme political right, whether that is the New York Times or all sorts of neo groups spread throughout the world. And it's certainly been a factor here in Australia as well. I'm not too sure if I want to go around trying to deconstruct the ideologies behind the Paul Paul within Judaism group, but we probably need to move on to a few other discussion questions. So, Michael.
I'm happy to let Mark Nanos I think he wanted to respond to the conversation, and then I'll shift to another question.
Okay, that's very generous of you, Michael. Mark, we'll hand back to you.
Thanks. I was going to say the same because I know that there are several of you ahead of me in the queue, but I did want to speak to the same thing because there's a lot of moving parts here. But one I think should be questioned is, why would you make a statement like that? And I don't mean that just in the case of Jorg. I mean, I see this in several prominent Pauline and New Testament scholars. And I've seen it in blog posts that are clearly aimed to dismiss the viability of the exegetical alternatives that are offered. And that seems not only does that seem, mean-spirited and in-house gatekeeping so that your readers know you don't have to bother with this, which leads to all sorts of questions that I have no intention of asking, but they're there because that's not what we're arguing. But we are arguing, I think many of us are arguing and are shaped in a post-Holocaust world to be attracted to this because it does have some humanitarian benefits. I can say that for myself, unabashedly, that I wouldn't be interested in Paul. I had a very nice business and a very nice life before this guy came in and interrupted it. And I discovered him in a historical question, if it could be read like the prophets. And it took me years before, I sort of realized, if you're right about this, then Christians would re-identify themselves in some positive ways with Jews and understand intercommunal rhetoric in a different way, which would affect their exegesis upon which these theological and therefore harmful ideological views are often based. So, hey, I got to do this. So I'm unabashed about it. But if I found Paul was different than that, I tell you now, as I tell myself, I would not try to make him what he wasn't. I'm trying to do good history here. I think he's been made into something that he wasn't, that I'm challenging. And he doesn't always fit nicely, of course, nobody would. I mean, this is history. But so far, most of the time, the guy, in terms of reading him within Judaism, comes out in a much more helpful place for humanity, and not just Jews, because the othering starts with Jews, but as African-American critics have shown, and as feminist critics have shown, and as gay, gay critics have shown, the othering that is tied to the way Paul is used against Jews and Judaism is a modus operandi for functioning. And if that could be changed, then, well, damn it, that's pretty good. So I'm on board with that. But I really don't think it's appropriate to say we're not doing history or doing exegesis when we are. And I hope we're not doing the same, in return.
Well, Mark, when you say that there's humanitarian implications, maybe that is what Jorg is drawing attention to, that in different ways I don't think he's saying that nothing you do has anything to do with exegesis, history, or the religion of antiquity, but is he drawing attention to maybe what are these humanitarian implications? And is he himself worried that maybe they are coloring some of the interpretive options that you're faced with? I mean, that's my sympathetic reading of Jorg, that's the very thing that he sees you doing on that side as noble. And I think the reasons you've enunciated are, quite frankly, very good reasons for doing that type of thing. How is Paul a resource for living in respectfully with difference today, which in a very fragmented world that we have is definitely a very good question. And this is why I think John Barclay talks about not just reading Paul, but doing what he calls a responsible reading of Paul, the ethics. So you could get into all those sorts of questions. I really want to go back to Michael, although I feel like we've just opened the can of worms and they're now crawling all over me. Michael, do you want to ask your question? How about we go, Michael? Then I think was it Murray. Then we can go back to Paula if that's okay. Out of all the hands, they're the hands I'm seeing. So, Michael.
Sure. Maybe my question won't shift it too much, so we can continue this conversation. I just want to, a lot of the papers mention, the problem of essentialism, right? That even sometimes when we use the language of something being thoroughly Jewish versus, what does that mean versus being thoroughly Canadian, or that people are diverse and they think diverse things. And I'm thinking of Jonathan Z. Smith and Fences and Neighbors, or Arnell and Crossley and all the. So I guess I just wonder, in light of that, could we imagine, Paul's Jewish, but he could either be a Jewish person who was Torah observant as he understood. I recognize there's different ways of understanding that, or be someone who, because he was a radically apocalyptic thinker, thought that his communities were now guided by Pneuma and not by the Torah, that he could be Jewish, and we can imagine both scenarios, and then it's just a matter of how we interpret, is his letters directed towards Gentiles only, or is the implied audience a Gentile, or the interlocutor in Romans a Gentile who wants to be a Jew, or is he speaking to both? Or then it becomes more an exegetical, what kind of Jew? Because I think, like what Paula mentioned about the Alexandrian Jews who, because they allegorize, because that was their way of understanding what it meant to follow their ancestral tradition. Or you think of the later Jewish demiurgical theologians who are very subversive to. So that would just be my question. Could we imagine a Jewish Paul having one or the other view, and then it's a matter of how do we interpret these letters?
Well, any comments on that, or any thoughts? Yeah, I mean, there's diverse ways of being Jews, I guess, from Philo to the teacher of righteousness and everything in between. And they're all in their own way, expressions of fidelity to the Jewish tradition, even if their manifestations are different, and different groups consider some to be deviant. But any other thoughts on that? No? Okay, well, thanks, Mike. That was a great way to try to change the conversation topic. But I can throw it back to Murray if you've got a comment or something you want to add, Murray.
Yeah, I guess my comment may build on what Michael was just saying, in that if we're asking the question, what does it mean to think about Paul within Judaism? The challenge that we've been talking about a lot is the variegated nature of Judaism in Paul's day. Which Judaism are we talking about? And we've got the essentialist question, and we've got debates, intra-Jewish debates about what it means to be faithful to Torah, etc. I think there's another layer to it which adds complexity, which is that Judaism has let me say more clearly, the scriptures, the Jewish scriptures, have an inbuilt sense of progress in them. There's eschatological expectation. There's a day coming when God will circumcise the people's hearts, Deuteronomy, when he'll pour out the Spirit, Ezekiel, when he'll make a new covenant, Jeremiah. So there's this inbuilt eschatological expectation, and that feeds into the variegated nature of Judaism in the first century, that different Jews are debating about what does this eschatological fulfillment look like, and how might Judaism be transformed in that eschatological age, and what's the place of the Gentiles in that eschatological age. And I think we've got to put Paul right in that mix, because that eschatology is crucial to his thought. At the end of the ages has come, is what he's saying. And so therefore that can, I think, help explain some of the reconfigurations, if that's the right word, or some of the newness, maybe a better word, of what we see in Paul. It's because of his conviction that we're now in the end of the ages, and therefore all of those prophecies are becoming activated, and therefore Judaism itself is entering into a new phase, if we can put it like that. But it's not a new phase that came from nowhere. It's a new phase that was spoken beforehand. And so he's just doing what Moses and the prophets said he's just proclaiming that everything that Moses and the prophets said would take place. We've now reached that. That's Acts 26, if we can go with the Luke and Paul. But in the letters, he says similar things. My gospel is according to the scriptures. I'm not doing anything new here, although it is new in the sense that what was promised beforehand has now come about. So I think that eschatological fulfillment piece is an important element in understanding Paul within Judaism.
Thanks for that, Mario. I mean, I think the promise fulfillment thing's a different thing to maintain, particularly with Paul himself, if he wants to maintain continuity, definitely has to still see himself within Judaism, or at least, at the very minimum, the Judaism's heritage. Paula, I think you've got something you want to add in?
Well, just thinking with all of these questions, think about the Qumran community. A solar calendar. Wouldn't step foot in the current temple. Don't like the high priest. Limit the number of the congregation of the saved. Don't accept circumcision. Does anybody stay up late at night worrying whether the Qumran community left Judaism or not? No. And this has to do with, again, I don't mean to do text and not context, but looking back at Jorge's text, what he says is, when he's talking about Jewish scholars like Mark Nanos or Paula Fredrickson, what they do is, it seems that they're aiming at a political effect to delegitimize further Christian critiques of Judaism. That's not why I look at these damn inscriptions. You know, you want to criticize Judaism, go ahead. It has nothing to do with my research on Paul.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Paula. David, you've got...
Yeah, look, thank you. I just was wanting to pick up the thread of where Murray was going, and maybe bring the R words back in to say that I think that there's an irreducible paradox here that Paul's conscious of, and it's built into his own language. And it seems to me to be epitomized in the benediction, if we accept it as Pauline, at the end of Romans 16, where Paul will say, in the space of, one sentence across 3 verses, that on the one hand, what he's talking about is something which was not previously made known. It's an eschatologically revealed mystery. And yet, in the very same breath, we'll say that it is now being made known to the Gentiles through the prophetic scriptures. So I don't think he's, on the one hand, he's either a kind of one-dimensionally scriptural foundationalist reading from left to right kind of guy, thinking you can argue from prophetic premises to the eschatological form in which it's taken, to Christ following conclusions, and just kind of get there by the force of sheer kind of facts and logic. You have to have the revelation of Christ. On the other hand, he'll want to say, and I guess it's a kind of, he's arguing, attempting some sort of coherentist epistemology in a sense. If once you've seen that, his gospel that he proclaims is a katastaphos gospel, and the very new things are being made known to the Gentiles through the prophetic scriptures. So I think it's a paradox that's built into how Paul reads scripture now, and he would be the first to confess that he reads scripture now differently from how he read scripture before the revelation that he describes in Galatians 1.
Yeah, David, one thing I tell students, tell me what you think of this, that the big debates that Paul has is about how new is the new covenant. Would that be a fair, if you add a little bit of hermeneutics to that, should I find a different sort of, catchphrase to use?
Well, I don't think it's just quantitative. It's in what way new is the new covenant? Yeah, and I think Paul is surprised by I don't think you can read Jeremiah 31 and say, there it is, everything that the form of the Christ following movement takes is kind of all there. If you hadn't encountered the crucified Jesus revealed from heaven as the Messiah. But yeah,
Great. Thanks, David. Mark, do you still have your hand up afresh, or is that from the old? Is that an old covenant hand or a new covenant hand?
That's a renewed covenant hand. There's so many moving parts, as was rightly said in Fry's paper and in others. You know, ethnicity is constructed and is very complicated. There's lots of ways. One of the ways that happens between groups is and one of the questions that's interesting to ask is, when did other people think that Paul wasn't Jewish anymore? So in the papers we had today in reception history, you have Jewish Christ-following groups at some point think, you know, Paul's not okay and his movement is not okay. It's not really Jewish enough anymore, or it's not Jewish at all. And likewise, sometimes the question is asked, you know, what did other Jews, like I think in Barclay and maybe in yours too, Mike, in trying to define anomalous, meaning, of course, he thought he was doing Judaism, but nobody else did. So at some point, there's some stretching, but at some point things break. And of course, we know we have a different movement that Paul's a way to read Paul that has been sustained more or less for 2,000 years. Developed, in which he's not doing Judaism. I mean, Christian theology does not have Paul doing Judaism. And if that's what you're putting on the map as within Judaism, that's not the same thing that I think we're trying to do. I really think that most other people would have said he's doing a Judaism, he's doing Mosaic Torah. That's why I think that's kind of important. But I mean, if Mosaic Torah is over, then what are we talking about when we talk about the people of Israel or Judaism? We're talking about something that's different, that's Christianity or whatever else it might have been. And so there's these points where I think it's kind of important to be a little picky and say, you know, this is the thing. If you no longer think the Mosaic Torah applies to the Jews in this movement, starting with Paul, things like circumcision, things like Sabbath, and so on, you know, key things, some that are in the 10 Commandments, then should you really call that Judaism anymore? You know, for all the newness and all the things that are moving because you think the awaited age has dawned, which requires halakhic adjustments to how you do Mosaic covenant as Jews and as non-Jews and then together, and being in a world that is still an evil age in Paul's view, to me that's a little different than, you know, taking Christian theological readings of Paul where it's not Judaism. And those translations that we work with were all done by people that don't think Paul was doing Judaism. And then calling that Judaism now, because we're making the umbrella so broad that it can account for Christianity. That at least is not what I think. I think the map was a lot broader, and the variegation that we discovered in the mid-20th century made all of this kind of possible to imagine, could Paul be on that map of Judaism? But not, if we move in a Christian map onto Judaism, to me, that's something different than at least what I'm trying to do. You know, that doesn't mean it's what everybody else isn't trying to do, but I don't think most of us are trying to do that. For that clarification, I hope that helps.
I think that's an important point, Mark, about, you know, if you're using a Christian map for what's Jewish and Christian and using the historical or the essentialist categories, you're going to get a different reading of Paul. But I still think there were some Jews who thought that Paul was definitely pushing the boundaries of what would be acceptable within Jewish communities. And I think he did get, for all sorts of reasons, religious and sociological, a difficult time from some of his Jewish compatriots. So even if Paul thought he was within Judaism, and I don't see any reason to think he didn't, some of his compatriots may not have shared that perspective.
Well, we could agree that the ones who punished him,
yeah, exactly,
they had to think he was. I mean, they have no right to punish him if he's left.
Yeah, but at the same time,
he wouldn't, you know, submitted himself to them.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's not just the punishment, but his willingness to submit to it. That's just as significant as him receiving the criticism, receiving the punishment, that he willingly submits to it. Yeah. Okay. How about we have two more points. I think that'll be maybe a good way to end up on. First one, how about we go to David, and then maybe we'll finish off with Paula.
Thanks. Look, I wonder whether one question to ask as a way of framing it might be whether in Paul's own self-understanding of his mission, he thought he was whatever reconfiguring he was doing was taking place within scripturally and Jewish sourced resources for reconfiguration. So whether it was about reconfiguring his Jewish identity and practice in light of a revelation about the messianic identity of the crucified Jesus and the experience of the outpouring of the Spirit, in which case I think you could very plausibly see Paul as doing whatever kind of modification and reconfiguring it, and it could be quite flexible still, but still within what he would describe as, according to the scriptures and the Messiah Jesus, eschatological reconfiguration of Judaism, or whether to some extent he was consciously in his program Hellenizing Judaism. So was he, as a matter of principle and program, seeking to find some sort of détente, some accommodation, some adaptation to Hellenize his ancestral faith for practice among the nations? And to that extent, you know, if he was Hellenizing it as his program, then I think the more he does of that, the less you could say that he's tethered to ancestral tradition and Jewish identity. But I think if it's the former, then I think even if there's a fair bit of elastic and if a lot of R words, you could make a claim for it being a within Judaism kind of movement. So
a Hellenistic Judaism light for Gentiles would not
I don't think he is. I don't think if you ask Paul, what are you doing here?
Yeah.
I don't think he'd say, I'm trying to find a new way for Jews to be among the Gentiles. I think he's saying, I'm inviting Gentiles to become believers in Israel's Messiah. And I'm inviting my fellow Jews to join with me in the unexpected form that the restoration of Israel and the outpouring of the Spirit has taken in the last days. That's how I'm reading what I think Paul was thinking he was doing.
Okay, thanks for that, David. I think we'll give the final word on this to Paula. Paula, you get to have the final word for our discussion here.
I don't think that is dignum et justum. I think that you should have the final word, since you were the person who put in all this effort to organize us over so many different time zones. I gave it my best shot in my paper. So thanking you for your courtesy, hand the mic back to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Paula. Well, in that case, the last thing I want to say is, well, first, thank you to everyone for attending, particularly in these diverse and challenging time zones. Thank you for the preparation for all the papers and all the effort that's been put in. And certainly the interaction as well has been very, very stimulating too. There'll be further instructions about what we're going to do next. I'll make all the videos go live at some point. But yeah, I'm just very, very grateful for the work that everyone else has put into this. Certainly my own college, Ridley College, thanks to Brian Rosner as well for the support that we've had from Ridley, and also to the Australian College of Theology, who have generously enabled this conference as well. So for me, this has been a good thing, particularly since we haven't had a couple of years where us Aussies have been able to do much conferencing with with each other or even our international friends. So it's great to have a forum where we can get a group of Australians with an international cohort of scholars and talk about some of the topics that we're very interested in, not just as academic things, but I guess things that are very important to religious communities and to the public discussion of ancient religion in our day and age. So thank you for everyone for their effort. If there's one thing I want to sum up is at the end of it, I think I definitely need a nap. That's the one thing I'll say is getting up for these last few mornings at about 5 a.m. Have certainly been taxing. But thank you everyone for coming. It's been a terrific time. And I wish you every blessing and success for the rest of the year.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks for making this possible.